Hello, everyone. We're glad you could join us again for another round of these, I guess what we're calling them is COVID conversations. I'm Pastor Clayton Sellers. I'm the associate pastor at Faith Lutheran Church in Collierville, Tennessee, right outside of Memphis. And I'm here today with Pastor Benjamin Delin, who's the sole pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Durango, Colorado. Ben, I'm very glad that you are able to join us today. And just for those folks who are watching, I need to say that Ben and I were at seminary together. And Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think basically every class that you could take at seminary, we took together with like three exceptions. So we spent a lot of time together for 4 years at seminary. So much so that Ben is the godfather and his wife is the godmother to my children, and myself and my wife are godparents to his children. And so I say that because I might slip and call you Bendy at this time, out of force of habit, out of closeness of friendship and brotherly love. So if I do, it's because our seminary class had so many different Bens uh, in our class, all in the same, basically all on the same track. And
Yep.
so you became Ben Delin, which quickly turned into Bendy. And so if I slip or if I say that, that's the background. But Ben, would you please introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about what you're doing and where you are and how long you've been doing it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be a part of this because I think it's an important conversation to be had. Yes, I'm a sole pastor in Durango, Colorado. I've been here 7.5 years. Clayton and I were also ordained on the same day.
Yeah, yeah,
And Clayton is my best man. So there's a lot of connection there.
yeah.
But we've both been serving as pastors to the day, the exact same length of
That's
time.
right. That's
Um,
right.
so I'm glad that I had some time with this congregation before COVID hit.
Okay.
Some of our other friends are kind of in a new call,
Yep.
and I think I don't know. I think they might say there were some things that made that easier,
Okay.
and some things that probably made that more challenging. I think one of the things that probably made it easier for one of them was they were so excited to have a pastor and someone to lead and someone to make decisions.
Yeah.
They were just glad to be able to rally with
Sure.
someone instead
Hmm.
of doing it all on their own.
Right.
Um, and
Now,
so I
how,
can see that, but I do think there is a benefit to the length of time that I've been here prior to COVID
yeah. So
responses.
before we get to that, tell us about the kind of a timeline of because everybody ended, everybody went streaming only at slightly different times. Like I think our congregation was a week later than most everybody else. Some might have been a week or two before. So just run us through the timeline of what it looked like in Durango, for everyone to kind of put it into context for how this happened.
So it was really interesting when health restrictions came down in mid-March, late March.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that health organizations aren't elected officials.
Hmm.
And so it's like what authority do they have? They're experts, but what authority do they have to, these are all the questions that were starting to
Yeah.
fill my emails and phone
Hmm.
calls. I spent more time on the phone in
Okay.
March and April than I ever had
And
before.
who are you talking to?
Members and other pastors,
Okay.
my district, my
Hmm.
mentor, um,
And tell us about
trying to
yeah. Tell us what you're
rebuff and
talking
make sure
about.
that I'm not just going rogue.
Okay. So
But so
you wanted some unity to make sure that you were working and in conjunction with kind of the same path as other congregations?
yeah, yeah. Spend a lot of time in Lutheran groups on Facebook, like
Mm.
listening and reading. And I've done a lot more different. Normally I'm reading like theology stuff
Right.
but then it turned into all this other type of reading.
Okay.
Um, but when the World Health Organization kicked something down, CDC grabbed it and then kicked it down, and then the state kicked it down, and then you have your local regional kick it down. And what really became evident early on in talking with other pastors is the highest authority is your city council.
Wow. Okay.
Not the president,
Right.
not the CDC. The highest power in the land is your city council and the police department who enforce it. And so it changed the veneer of things when people were saying, well, the CDC says this. Yeah, but the US Marshals are not the ones that police our streets.
Right.
Our local police department does. So that kind of, it brought in another aspect of how we relate to the fourth commandment, to think theologically about it.
Sure.
So we went remote worship. I believe our first Sunday was March 30th.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you were even a week later than we were, I think, then.
Maybe it was the 23rd. It was, I'd have to write it down.
Sure.
I have a lot of things written down that are going to go into some kind of a journal.
Oh, okay.
In the future, just making sure I don't forget stuff.
Yeah.
And so but it was in the late March period.
Okay. And when y'all went remote, were you in the sanctuary with a small team or a small team around you, or did you do it from some other location? How did that play out?
Okay, so we had on March, let's see, the 15th.
Okay.
So it was the middle of March. We had local restrictions come down.
Okay.
And there were a lot of people that just were scared. So when we did that, I pulled out my iPhone. iPhones, these devices, I'm on an iPhone right now, are amazing.
Yeah.
And the audio is really good. The video is really good. And so I used my iPhone on a tripod. I have more lights and tripods and things than I ever thought I'd ever need. I have lights everywhere in my house because I do devotions there now.
Oh, okay.
But we did a live service on March 15th, and there was some odd pushback for still being in person because of what I think is a lack of clarity from our local health department.
Okay.
And then when it came to two weeks later on the 29th, I pulled it all remote to my house.
Oh, to your house?
To my house. On the 22nd, we did it in church with no one in there, just me and the organist and my reader.
Okay.
On the 29th, our numbers went through the roof because Durango's a resort ski town.
COVID numbers or?
COVID numbers.
COVID numbers, okay.
Because Durango is a resort ski town, and that was right around spring breaks. And so spring breaks hit in the middle of March. And then all of a sudden we got a COVID testing center a week later, and the numbers just went off and everyone got kind of skittish. Right. So we went hard remote to my home. Okay. And then I started pre-recording and premiering to YouTube and Facebook at the same time. Okay. But that's just pre-recording is tough, especially when I'm my own IT guy, my video guy, my video editor. I have to do it all because I'm really the only one that knows how to, I guess. So
now real quick, why did you, just for the sake of clarity and conversation again, why did you decide to record and premiere as opposed to doing like a Facebook Live or streaming straight to YouTube?
Well, YouTube, in order to do live, you have to have 100,000 followers.
Oh, really?
And so you can't do a true live broadcast like you can do live on Facebook without having enough followers. And so there were a couple forums of Lutheran communicators on Facebook where we shared our links to try to get like us
Right.
all to subscribe to each other
Sure,
to
sure.
get to 100,000 followers so that we could all stream live on the
Right.
YouTube.
Okay.
And it didn't work. I mean, we have like 200 on
Oh,
our YouTube channel that subscribe to it. We have more that watch it, but
yeah.
not subscribe. So YouTube became challenging. And so in order to do a premiere, it's a premiere of a fully recorded video
Right.
on YouTube.
Okay.
And I wanted to do them at the same time just so that I didn't have to do multiple things at the
Sure.
same time.
Sure.
And then you could watch it. Because the big thing that we had right away is people still wanted to come to church,
Oh.
but they wanted it to be at 9:30, which is when our worship service is. We have one.
Yep.
So we have one service, it's at 9:30, and they wanted to be at home at that time doing the same thing with everyone else to get that sense of community.
Right.
And they wanted to see Pastor Clayton is watching, and
Sure.
Pastor Ben and his kids are watching on the little ticker, and
Yeah.
and feel that community a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I really worked to make that happen. But
Okay.
but the editing to
Mhm.
get that YouTube video, I had to have the worship service recorded in total by
Okay.
noon on Friday
Oh, wow. Okay.
in order to get it fully ready and
Mhm.
queued by 9:30 on Sunday.
Wow. Now,
Because
I'm gonna
YouTube and Facebook are eternal enemies.
Sure.
They hate each other.
right. Capulets and
And
Montagues.
so they
right?
make it very difficult.
Yeah. Now, real quick, that whole idea of or experience of, I want to come back to you recording it at home, but that experience of recording a worship service by noon on Friday, what's that like as a pastor when 95% of what 95% of the people see happens on Sunday morning, right? Sunday morning, for me starts at like 5:30 and goes until about 2 or 2:30 in the afternoon. But now to have all of that taken away, and now you're doing your Sunday stuff sometime on Thursday afternoon or Friday morning and in your home, what's that like as a pastor to now be doing Sunday stuff not on a Sunday?
Very uncomfortable.
Really?
I did not like it
What
in any
about
way,
it was
shape, or form.
what about it was so uncomfortable?
Well, I mean, it messed up everything. It messed up my shaving schedule. Like everything is different.
But that's how deep seated some of this disruption is, right? Is even just
Right.
those little patterns and habits we've gotten into. How else was it uncomfortable?
To get keyed up and geared up and excited
Mm,
with an empty room.
okay.
And especially when even when we were doing it live, because after a while we realized we could do it live just on Facebook. So we
Okay.
ditched YouTube and went
Okay.
straight to Facebook
Hmm.
and dedicated everything to live on Facebook. But even then, I'm just interacting with a black box.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have no faces. I have no sounds of my kids doing what they're maybe not supposed to be doing, which
Sure.
is beautiful. When
Right.
kids are in church and not doing what they're supposed to do, parents need to know
Right.
it's okay.
A little
It's
background
okay.
noise in a sanctuary is just fine.
It actually feeds the excitement and the buzz of stuff.
Yeah.
Now, as a parent, you talk to your kids and say, this is not appropriate. Notice how everyone else isn't doing
Sure.
this. But you need to
Sure.
know that everyone else is fueled by there's excitement here. And so then all of a sudden, I am doing it to an empty room
Mhm.
or this little nook in my house where my children used to sleep in their cribs. Now I have it decked out with like paraments.
So you brought paraments and all your vestments and everything in?
Yep.
Okay.
And my guitar.
Oh, okay.
And I sang the whole service. I have
wow.
the hymnal
Mhm.
in guitar books,
Oh,
in the chord books for piano and guitar. And I did the whole liturgy
Mm.
in my home for about 5 weeks, I think.
Okay.
We did it for 5 weeks. And so we did Easter service in my little nook in my home.
Wow.
I did not like that.
No. Oh, but Now I'm going to ask you this. You didn't like it because it was different it wasn't what we were trained to do. It wasn't what we've experienced for the
Mhm.
last 7 years. You and I being pastors for, at the time it was 6.5, 7 years, right?
Yeah.
But now as uncomfortable as it was there any, looking back on it now, or even in the time, was there any blessed part of it? Was there, talk about maybe the sacredness or the sanctity of worship, that you're in your spare bedroom with a guitar by yourself in a black box, but yet was it still worship?
Well, yeah. Yes.
Say
Um,
more about that for us.
so getting all geared up devotionally,
Mm-hmm.
energy wise,
Mm-hmm.
wasn't any different
Okay.
because on a Sunday morning, uh, I say goodbye to my family and I head off to church, and then
Mm-hmm.
it's my prayers, it's my preparation, and it's quiet largely,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just me and God and all my preparations. So
Right.
that none of that changed.
Okay.
That that still felt extremely worshipful preparation.
Okay.
And so I was able to get in the mindset to do it.
Mm.
Um, it's just I didn't have necessarily the direct feedback
Yeah.
until I started getting. I mean, people started commenting
Oh, uh-huh.
on the feeds or in emails,
Yeah.
or they hate it for the first 2 or 3 weeks, but then you start to get people going, I'm hearing that pastors aren't even doing this.
Oh, okay.
Uh, they're just recording the audio of a devotion, and that's
Uh-huh.
all we get.
Oh, okay.
Um, Actually, two of the most encouraging things I heard were from
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
predecessor and his predecessor, who still both worship here.
Oh, okay.
Um, they've been wonderful supporters. They
Oh,
said,
good.
I'm so glad it's you and not me, because I would not have known what to do.
Yeah.
Uh, one of them still has a flip phone. Like they're not doing any of this kind of stuff
Yeah.
at all. They wouldn't have been able to do it. And then they've stayed home too because they're elderly. And they
Mm-hmm.
said, I never thought that this could feel so worshipful.
Okay.
And then it's on them to prepare.
Right.
And so what then I started to realize is the preparation steps that I go through in my quietness
Uh-huh.
of a Sunday morning, I needed to kind of equip the members for some of that,
Oh, okay.
for doing it in a different setting like this
Right.
instead of in the sanctuary.
Right. So what did
I
that,
had some people
what
I
did
had some
you,
people that wanted to bring their phone and sit in the sanctuary,
hmm.
watch the feed of me in my nook at
Uh-huh.
my house.
So what did you do to
Um,
help them make that streaming option to be worshipful? What was it that you were saying or encouraging them to do to make it be such a worshipful time for them, even on a device, on their couch, maybe in their bed, on their dining room table? What was that? What were those encouragements?
well, I started at the same time realizing that parents were feeling overwhelmed because that's when homeschooling was really taking off,
Right.
and they were like, I love my kids, but now I'm starting to question what my motive was for loving them.
Uh-huh.
And they're overwhelmed. Their
Yeah.
job expectations have remained the same, and now it's parents all the time.
Right.
So I started looking through all the resources that I have
Okay.
at my disposal and the research that I've done, and I was like, I need to get people comfortable with the resources that they have.
Right.
One of the coolest things that we did right before COVID started in
Uh-huh.
January
Uh-huh.
is we got a donation for
Oh, yeah.
my first hymnal.
Okay.
This thing is cool. It
Uh-huh.
has basically the whole catechism in it.
Okay.
It has a good chunk of prayers. It has some of the Psalms. And what we did is I gave one to every family in our congregation.
Okay.
And then at the end of every children's message, we sing one of the songs.
Oh, nice. Okay.
So I was teaching the kids, and the
Mhm.
parents were like hearing it like, okay, we'll use that one for the rest of the week then, because at least I know this song.
Sure, sure, sure.
And I started doing little devotionals on YouTube and Facebook recorded where I would go through a different song every day,
Okay.
and how to use this in the home.
Okay.
And then I also said, those kinds of preparations you can do before bedtime.
Uh-huh.
You can do before worship on Sunday,
Yeah.
before there's meal prayers, there's Luther's morning service, evening
Yep.
service, morning prayer, evening prayer. And the kicker is this, while it looks like a child's book,
Mm-hmm.
nothing's been changed from this guy.
Right. The service book.
It's
Yeah.
just abbreviated. It's
Yeah.
just fewer things, but it's
Right.
all the same content. So mom and dad, your preparation for worship
Mm-hmm.
isn't much different.
Right.
And so the quick hit list is the prayers that are on the front inside cover.
Those are
You
such
have
a great
prayers.
resource.
This is amazing. This is
Yeah.
wonderful. Upon entering the church, before worship, after worship, before and after confession, absolution, the sacrament, some ad hoc prayers
Mm-hmm.
for Sunday, for worship day.
Yeah.
And then there's the creeds and the Lord's Prayer. Like,
Okay.
if you do inside front cover, inside back cover, you're going to get in the mentality for worship.
Sure.
You just will.
Right.
And then to see that the kids can have the same thing and you're
Mhm.
sitting next to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So the amazing thing about this was we had a wonderful donation to get just a ton of these, get them in the homes right before COVID hit. And I trained them to use it before
nice.
COVID hit. It was
Okay.
a really God thing. It was a really cool thing.
Very, very
But-
serendipitous.
Oh, it was just remarkable. But then I was able to lean on this
Okay.
because I knew what was in the homes.
Right. Right.
So then I still, even when the sanctuary was empty, or for a while we didn't have kids coming, we had adults, but the kids were all at home.
Okay.
I'd say, and go get your My First Hymnal. We're
Oh,
going to
yeah.
use this in a minute. You might even open to page 57. We'll go
Sure.
to that one in just a minute.
Right.
And so by the time I got used to interacting with a black box and I was
Mhm.
comfortable with it, they were used to me interacting with them as if I'm just right here, and it's children's message.
Sure.
So I think this one was really cool in helping families and adults.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I told them this isn't any different than that hymnal, they were like, well, I have that at home.
Right.
And it kind of changed the devotional life of the
Sure.
congregation too at that point,
Sure.
at least in April.
Yeah.
And then we did some other things later last summer.
That gives me an idea for our live stream. We have a welcome screen with a countdown. It's like a 5-minute countdown so people can get all their stuff set up. And it says fill out our online attendance card, find the order of worship. Here's how you can give your offerings. Here's the website. We're glad you could join us. But if we could add to that opening slide one of those prayers from the front of the hymnal.
Oh,
to say, hey,
I like that.
Here's a way to prepare, because one of the things I tell people is, hey, I know you're at your kitchen table. I know you're on your couch casting this up to your TV. Maybe you're still in bed or you're sitting on the couch holding your phone, but this is still a time of worship. And we want to, make this time a holy time, a sacred time, honor the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. So to reduce those distractions.
I like that.
So on this idea of worship, and I want to come back to doing it at home because I want to talk about what it's like as a pastor with the family and doing these things. So we'll come back to that though in a little bit. Talk about how your congregation, how St. Paul's handled communion during this time. What did y'all end up doing for communion? And talk a little bit about that decision process.
That's a good question. I wish I had one right here. The long and short of it is we got the one world cup or one communion cup, self-contained communion cups.
Okay.
They, a number of years ago, actually got a variance to ship the alcohol, to actually ship them with wine.
Okay.
They were the first company to get that.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're able to get them with actual communion. So that was, or with actual wine in them. So that was the biggest hurdle.
Okay.
Was how do we get social distance. How
Right.
do you take off a mask, but yet you're right next to a ton of people?
Yeah.
And so I'm calling district office, I'm calling other pastors,
Sure.
I'm looking at these forums, trying to figure out what is the meet, right, and salutary appropriate
Yeah.
way to do
Yeah.
this. And do we make COVID contingencies that we wouldn't otherwise make?
Mm-hmm.
Does that set a precedent
Right.
that we can do this whenever? What
Mm-hmm.
about home communion? All of that came into play.
Okay.
But what we ended up doing
Mm-hmm.
is we have these communion. I wish I had one. So
Sure.
it's like a little chalice,
Okay.
and there's a hole in the bottom,
Uh-huh.
and there's a seal on it with the wafer inside of it.
Okay.
So you have the unleavened bread on the underside with
Uh-huh.
it's like a creamer, creamer at a cafe.
Okay.
They're really easy to open. So
Yeah.
there's a creamer on the bottom, or creamer seal on the bottom with the
Sure.
wafer inside of it, and then there's wine with
Uh-huh.
another seal on top, and so
Okay.
you have a self-contained. It's literally about the size of a coffee creamer that you see
Okay.
at a diner. And so my secretary, with glove and mask, especially when we didn't know as much about
Right.
surfaces and things like
Right.
that,
Right.
she'd wear a glove and mask, and we had set stations around the sanctuary for,
Okay.
we know that this couple is coming, 2 communicant members, this family's coming with 2 adults and 2 kids,
Right.
so they'll need 4 bulletins but only 2
Okay.
of these things. And they were set up around the sanctuary. But this raises a question about the words of institution.
Yeah.
And so, we're thinking about this theologically.
Yeah.
Is the words of institution a proximity to
Mm.
the officiant saying them, the celebrant saying the words of institution?
Yeah.
Does that transmit digitally?
Sure.
And so, the COVID communion CTCR came
Mhm.
out like the fastest CTCR document
Right.
ever received.
Yeah. Now, real
it
quick.
takes years to get these things, people, and we get them in like 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Boom, boom.
Now, real quick, tell everybody what the CTCR is. Just a real brief for those who might not know what the CTCR is. Give a real quick description of what that body is.
Commission on Theology and Church Relations is
Okay.
what the CTCR stands for.
Yeah.
And it's a group of people, theologically trained, faithful, confessional people
Mm-hmm.
that look through a topic has been presented that isn't explicitly brought up in Scripture.
Okay.
For example, there's one on gambling.
Right.
And we need a little bit more detail on it.
Okay.
How do we understand and interpret it
Mm-hmm.
in light of Scripture?
Okay.
But then there are topics that are addressed in Scripture, but need a little bit more robust work done
Sure.
on them.
Okay.
So there's communion
Right.
and inspiration of Scripture, things that are in Scripture, but we need it fleshed out for us a little bit more.
So would it be fair to say the CTCR issues kind of not policy, but statements of belief, like the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod believes this about fill in the blank, and that becomes the official position of the LCMS?
I'd say that's a
Okay.
very good way to describe it. Yeah.
So
they came out with one on distanced communion or home communion,
right. Okay.
which they actually had. We had something similar, or in the communion document there was a reference to it, but it wasn't fully fleshed out.
Sure.
So when COVID occurred and people started asking questions, we got a more robust document on that specific topic.
Now, I'm thanks for sharing about how you were doing your socially distanced communion. When you were leading worship and recording it up in your spare room, what were y'all doing for communion then? What was your approach then? I know some folks were doing, for lack of a better term, not to dismiss the importance of the sacrament, but some people were doing like a drive-through communion. People would drive up to the covered entrance of the sanctuary building, and the pastor would have a prayer and confession and absolution and commune them in their cars. So what was it that you were doing at St. Paul's especially during that lockdown time when
Right.
nobody was coming to the sanctuary?
We didn't have it during the worship service, obviously, because it was just me and the black box.
Right.
But we made it available by appointment. And because we were on lockdown for such a short period of time, I didn't have as many requests as I thought I would.
Okay.
And you know, I in talking with other pastors, I have noticed, like we mentioned earlier, that each local health department is different. Each local municipality is different.
Right.
Ours was people were afraid. And so it wasn't even a request that,
Okay.
and there was a point where I just wasn't even going to bring the topic up because it wasn't something they were willing to be persuaded on yet.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to break the equity of trust in that relationship at the time. So if people didn't want it, we didn't know how long it was going to last at that time either.
Right.
So I was like, you know what, for now, we got the word, we're going to do the word thing.
Sure.
And I'm still working this out. The other thing that's tricky for me is that our circuit is, I think it's the second largest circuit in the US.
Okay.
The geographic.
You're in Southwest Colorado, right? You're 3 hours
Correct.
north of Albuquerque and 7 hours up and over the mountains from Denver, right?
Correct.
Okay.
And so we have all 4 states of the 4 corners in our circuit.
Okay.
So we have Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado in my circuit.
Wow. Okay.
So there's a church that one-way drive is 6.5 hours away from me in my circuit.
Yeah.
And my closest church is an hour away.
Right. And
one-way
just
drive.
For those who haven't,
we have different states. We have different.
I would say for those who don't think of LCMS churches as being in circuits, there are places in like St. Louis or in the Midwest where all your circuit churches might be within 25 minutes of each other.
Right. Right. And you have 2 local churches within a mile of each other. Like it's really totally different. Right. So one of the things that also impacted the decision that I made and that my elders helped me make in the church council, like everyone was informed, but they were really glad that there was someone to make a decision.
Sure.
But one of the difficulties is that my circuit visitor is in a different state and under a different health department restriction.
Right.
And there are 2 other states in my circuit. On top of that, we have a congregation in the Navajo reservation. Which is its own sacred country.
Right. An own sovereign nation there. Yeah.
They have a totally different mandate. They're still on full lockdown now.
Really? Okay.
They're not, he's been doing worship from his home since March.
Wow.
And they haven't gone back.
Wow. And so that circuit, it was shaping how you wanted to do things with that unity of brotherhood, that shared confession. Is that what you're driving at here?
That's part of it. And also when I'm asking them advice, there's a slew of other things that are going into their decision making. And then, you know, I was talking with Dr. Veltz about this actually the other day. How do we talk about seminary professor? He was also kind of he's my golf coach and soccer coach. So I got to spend a lot of time with him. And I saw him at a conference a couple weeks ago, and we got to talk about this. And he was talking about Romans 14.
Okay.
And how the weak and the strong of faith relate to each other. Okay. And I wanted to go with 1 Corinthians 6 and the discussion of food sacrifice to idols.
Right.
But he said that's not fair. You need to actually use Romans 14. Okay. Because Romans 14, Paul is saying that it's not just about the weak not exploiting, or the strong not exploiting the weak.
Mm-hmm.
The weak can't exercise a tyranny of weakness either.
Oh, uh-huh.
So you got to go look at Romans 14, and
Oh,
he
okay.
worked through that with me on the golf course. It was
Yeah,
awesome.
of course.
And I was like, that is exactly what's happening.
Okay.
So, when you have other churches, other pastors that are in a
Mhm.
circuit, you have your own congregation, you have your own city, municipality making decisions.
Yeah.
You got weak and strong all over the place.
Yeah.
And you take into consideration how they're making decisions.
Sure.
Are they weak or strong? Are they humbly and gently dealing in
Right.
love with one another?
Right.
Is there a point of admonishment to be had? Is it emotionally based? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it all of a sudden just became a mess.
Yeah.
For making one decision regarding communion or
Right.
opening worship. And so when it comes down to it, something that I'd like members of my church and other churches to know
Mm-hmm.
is that while these decisions were being made by your pastor, they weren't really about COVID ever.
Mm-hmm.
The decisions aren't about COVID. It was always about people.
Right.
It was always about people.
Yeah.
If you think about a family vacation, well, I want to go to Disney World. Well, I
Mhm.
want to go to the mountains. Are
Mhm.
you talking about a vacation? No, you're talking about the people affected by this decision one way or
Sure.
another. Are
Sure.
you siding with me or are you siding with them? That's what it's about.
Yeah.
It's about people. And when you saw it about people, it's a lot easier to make these theological decisions instead
Mhm.
of medical decisions.
Right.
Now
Right.
you're informed. We have doctors in the congregation
Oh, sure.
and so you're making informed decisions based on medical information, but it comes down to the people whom those decisions
Yeah.
affect. And that was a lot more complicated than you
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. And I think so. I just kind of refocus us a little bit. We started on this topic of communion and how does this work and doing some theological things and the social distancing, but you got a little bit broader in terms of what does it look like to live together as a congregation in these times.
Yeah.
The one of the strings that we'll pull on for this from what you were saying is a decision had to be made, and none of those decisions were easy, and none of those decisions were taken lightly, especially
Correct.
as you were leading this congregation. Now we started off talking about your length of service there, 7.5
Ooh.
years at St. Paul's. How did that 7.5 years shape your pastoral leadership in these times?
Well, the way in which I felt it was a strength to have been here for 7 years, 6.5 by the time it started,
Yeah.
is I had developed a cache of chips,
Oh, okay.
a trust bank
Uh-huh.
of relationships of previous things that were seen as positive by
Okay.
my leadership and by
Mhm.
members. And so even if someone disagreed with me, I'd say, be patient with me because there's some things that I'm not telling you that went
Right.
into this decision,
Uh-huh.
and I'm not going to,
Yeah.
because there are private conversations I've had under the shroud of trust and confession
Right.
with our fellow members that have weighed into this.
Mhm.
And I ask you to trust me.
Yeah.
And then a lot of times people go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Well, thank you for saying that. And other times, well, that doesn't, why are you making decisions based on them instead of me as well?
Right.
And then I shared within pastoral discretion enough
Right.
to get that equity back and say,
Okay.
it'll be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then the one thing that I remember talking about with Dr. Bierman in one of his classes at the seminary
Mm-hmm.
is similar to what we probably all kind of encountered in October and November regarding voting.
Oh, uh-huh.
I remember Dr. Bierman saying, you pray over your decision,
Mm-hmm.
you make a decision, you go into the booth, you cast your vote, you come out and you repent and you go on with your life.
Right.
Because no matter how you voted,
Mm-hmm.
you're complicit in a human being sinning by means of the authority that they now have.
Yeah.
And so when it came to this kind of a decision, I'm like, I can see how there's a case for this is wrong both ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
What am I supposed to do? And so
Right.
you make a decision, you repent of it, you ask for support for
Mm-hmm.
where you realize, well, maybe that was the wrong decision, but it's
Mm-hmm.
we made it
Yeah.
and we're moving forward.
Yeah. So I want to take a step back a little bit. I appreciate all of that insight into make the decision-making process, to know that none of this was easy, to get to the point of closing the sanctuary or working from leading worship from your spare room or communion or any of these things. I appreciate you sharing with us how much thought and effort and emotion and prayer and contemplation and reflection went into that. I want to take a step back. You talked about, especially in the first couple of months, March, April, May, how you weren't having any communion appointments because you got the sense that people were just so afraid. Um, and I'm curious how that perception on your part of knowing your people, how did that and the whole pandemic and even the months following, even up to now, how has that shaped your preaching and the way that you deliver the word, whether it's from home and how you preach from home to a black box, as you said, or their situation or what you know about their lives? How has this shaped your preaching?
Well, it continued to change as I was paying attention,
Okay.
because some people didn't want to talk about it.
Mm.
They didn't want to give it power.
Uh-huh.
It just instills more fear to talk about it. And church is my one reprieve from the world.
Right.
I want my reprieve. Give me my reprieve from that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to talk about COVID. So there were seasons or sermons or weeks where I didn't mention it at all, really, other than to maybe pray for essential workers or things like that.
Right.
But then we actually engaged in a 4-part sermon series on where is God in the coronavirus.
Oh, uh-huh.
And it took it head on.
Sure.
How do we deal with suffering in the world?
Oh, yeah.
How can God be an all-powerful God and let something like this happen?
Uh-huh.
So we got into some of the big characteristic issues with who God is. Is he truly unmutable, unchangeable in his attributes? So it actually offered an opportunity to delve into who is God in the milieu of COVID.
Sure.
But then I also, I completely saw the need for the reprieve from it and to step aside from it. And God is bigger than this. Therefore, we don't need to talk about it all the time.
Right.
And I see it similar as to, we know that the devil is a prowling lion seeking whom he will devour, but we don't talk about it all the time. We know our own complicit nature in sin. And so we don't always blame the devil.
Okay.
Luther did a lot more than most of us do.
Sure.
Shows up in a lot of his prayers, actually, quite a bit if you're paying attention. But similar to that, you don't always go and talk about, well, Lord, protect us from the evil one. You don't say it all the time. You just focus on God, who's the mighty one, and you talk about him. So I would say I vacillated by means of giving people a break from the discussion. Okay. Because who wasn't talking about it all the time? And so can we just have a time where I can have soul rest and have Sabbath? And I saw that pretty darn quickly, that fatigue, that COVID fatigue was setting in. Man, even in early April, people didn't want to talk about it. Right. And so you'd take it up maybe at a certain part of the service and then you'd leave it. Sure. Things like that.
Yeah. One of the things that I noticed was it was everybody was going through the same situation. Everybody was kind of in the same boat, in the same particular boat. Everybody's always in that boat of sinfulness, and we need to hear the law, or we're all
Right.
in some different ways contemplating our own mortality and how near death is. But on a pre-COVID days, there was, you might have to work hard to touch this particular person or this person or
Yeah.
this group of people. But everybody was focused on the same thing. And so
Yeah.
I noticed that it was not easier, but easier to hit the congregation and get that law
Yeah.
and that gospel, those both sides of God's word, and do it in such a way that it hit everybody
Yeah.
at once. I don't know if you had a similar reflection on that part.
Definitely.
Okay.
I, people on all sides of the debate
Mm-hmm.
were frustrated.
Yeah.
It didn't matter what your thoughts were on any discussion of COVID.
Uh-huh.
You were frustrated.
Yeah.
You were overwhelmed. You were tired. And I think what really came out right before we went fully back into the sanctuary.
Okay.
So right towards the end of April, beginning of May,
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden people really were clinging to the worship service more.
Mm.
We're clinging to those little devotionals that I was
Uh-huh.
doing more,
Yeah.
because it was the only semblance of community that they really kind of were having. You're not going to restaurants.
Right.
You weren't going to the gym. All that stuff was closed.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you realized what a beautiful thing you had,
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to come back. And something that I said early on, I want to say it might have even been one of the last Sundays in March, was I got a phone call from one of the members.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the church, the Una Sancta, the one holy Christian church, will survive this?
Oh, wow.
And I had to ask for forgiveness later, because I laughed. I giggled at it.
Uh-huh.
And they said, "I'm serious." I said, I'm sorry. I realize you are, and I'm not trying to make light of it. Of course. And the reason I laughed is because I think the church will be stronger coming out of it.
Uh-huh.
And he said, "I don't see how."
Mm-hmm.
How? Because it's going to distill life down to what really matters.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to the gym. Maybe you canceled that subscription because you can't use it.
Yeah.
And what becomes important? People. What are you craving? To be back in the sanctuary with your family of faith.
Yeah.
And so now that you don't have that, you realize, man, maybe I need to invest more once we're back in these people, because I see how they're struggling more than I am with the emotional aspect or something like that. And it's also becomes evident when you look at church history that the church thrives under persecution.
Oh, yeah.
So, people were saying, and still kind of are saying, that the church is being persecuted. It's going against religious freedom and things like that. You might be right. I don't think it's the same kind of persecution that led to Stephen's stoning.
Sure.
I mean, that's a little different when what you're preaching is told you can't do it.
Yeah.
Or that you can preach altogether.
Yeah.
The church has always thrived under persecution, and it does very poorly under prosperity. And so to be stretched, I think it did some good things.
Yeah.
I think the church is going to have to heal, though, in many ways. Heal from maybe some of the decisions. People have left churches over decisions that pastors and leadership have made, and that's sad on a number of levels. But I do think the church will come out stronger, because it's about Jesus then. Because it can't be about a program, and it can't be about a building. It's about Jesus Christ and his word.
Right.
And now you see, we do have a mission, and it's clear now, because it wasn't just about programs.
Right. Everything's been stripped away back down to its basics. Right.
And so a lot of this is also going to lead to churches reevaluating what are essential things
Okay.
to us reaching the community around us
Uh-huh.
and bringing the gospel to people. Is that program a feel-good program, or does it have meat to it? Does it actually act as a bridge to bring the gospel to people? And so it might cause some criticism to look at all of the programs and activities a church does. And I think that's where it's going to be a positive.
Yeah. So what is that looking like for St. Paul's right now?
Well, interestingly enough, we started asking this question 2 years ago.
Oh, okay.
We brought in Lutheran Church Extension Fund.
Okay.
And their vision path process.
Okay.
To help us evaluate how best we're utilizing our programs and our mission.
Okay.
Which it sounds weird to talk about our mission because, the Great Commission, if you look at a mission from any church, it's got the Great Commission in there. Every church is Christ's church. Right. But no church is on this exact hill in this town, in this neighborhood.
Sure. Right.
Context with these matters. Neighbors that drive by every day.
Yeah.
So our mission is Christ's mission, but how we carry it out might look a little different. And so evaluating that. And so the question is that I asked the church council, if the church ceased to exist here, would anyone miss us? Well, instead of being somber, let's think about how we can fix that or change that.
Sure.
So LCEF helped us work through this process and start evaluating some of their growth areas, but we call them targets.
Okay.
So we exhaustively listed out all the ministries we have, and then looked at gaps in them.
Okay.
So we came up with and there's a lot of excellent leadership. I support this program. It's been really, really great for us to just get the leadership to think theologically and mission-minded about programs.
Okay.
But we came up with 5 pillars for evaluating any one program.
Okay.
So if you look at a Sunday Bible study class, or you look at a ski trip or a youth group, you evaluate it on these 5 things: time with God, time with each other, caring for people's physical needs, caring for people's spiritual needs, and Christian education.
Okay.
So there's a lot of different ways to evaluate programs, but that's with their leadership what we came up with.
Yeah.
And we started to see that we had gaps in some pillar areas.
Okay.
And so the question is, do you take an already existing program and you add in parts of those gaps, or do you start new programs to fit those gaps?
And so COVID though brought all of those to a stop, with the exception of Sunday morning worship. What is it looking like for St. Paul's to bring some of those back under those 5 pillars?
So that's a good question. The interesting thing is, while COVID stopped a lot of the programs, the evaluation process, it made it a lot easier.
Oh, okay.
Because you don't have your volunteers doing a million other things because they can't. Yeah. And so you just have them doing what they can do, which it freed up time for my leaders instead of having them burned out on this big project. Yeah. So what it has done is it's allowed us to evaluate what we're currently doing and project where God wants us to go in the name of Jesus.
Sure.
Without actually having to start it yet. So the cool thing is, with everything pausing, is we've been able to kind of build the ship before we have to launch it.
I see. Or even trying to fix the ship as it's going.
Right, which is just as much of a problem.
Yeah.
So the cool thing is, we have our ministry plan for those target areas, those growth areas, and where normally you do a full launch on this, we're doing a soft launch starting this Sunday. Okay. And the full launch is for the congregation as a whole. But the congregation is comprised of individuals. Yeah. So the soft launch is geared towards you. You fulfilling this, because you are still the church with your
Mhm.
neighbors, and
Right.
you can still fulfill these things in light of your neighbors.
Yep.
Do you care for their physical needs or spiritual needs or
Yeah.
things like that? So there are ways for now. What I'm going to help, we're going to work through in this sermon series is
Mhm.
how can I do these things in my life
Mhm.
every day?
Cool. That's it. That's really exciting. So as you're coming back into a life together as St. Paul's in Durango, you're being conscientious and deliberate about how you bring those different programs back. It's not as if you're just turning the clock back to March
Right.
7th, 2020 and picking up from there, but you're saying,
Yeah.
hey, things have changed. How do we adjust and do things maybe a little bit different? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that it is. Carey Nieuwhof, are you familiar with that author?
Yeah, I know. I've read a few of his blog entries. I don't follow him,
Yeah,
closely.
he had an article recently about how the church will relate to its building differently after
Oh,
COVID.
okay.
And I was really intrigued by that. And I dug deeper into this article, which was it was a longer article than some of his normal ones. So it had more meat in describing it.
Hmm.
But I think it's similar to what you're asking. When you look at a program, all of your members have been deployed to their homes for a
Hmm.
while, and they're church. So how do you relate? You don't look at the church as church happens here
Hmm.
because it has to happen in a building. No, you're going to start to see churches, the people of God in the world, doing life with people.
Sure.
And so you could use a building, but it's not necessitated to carry out ministry.
Right.
And so I think that's where you're exactly right. It's going to evaluate, you're going to have to reevaluate
Hmm.
anything before you start it back up again.
Yeah.
And you might just go, you know what, this evaluative process was good, and we're keeping everything the same
Sure.
because that one fits all the pillars.
Yeah.
Great.
Awesome.
And this one, it's kind of more of a social club gathering.
Yeah.
Could we give it a little bit more intentionality to it?
Mhm.
Yeah, maybe we could.
Yeah.
And then you might actually go, that it'd take a little bit more work to make that intentional. So we're going to cut that out.
Yeah.
But we're going to add something else in that can feed those kinds of things.
Sure. Now, so you were talking about, your missional and being the church is made up of individuals. And so your soft launch that you've got going makes me think about a pastor with a family doing church at home on a Thursday afternoon. How has this been? As we've talked a lot about the theological thinking and that vocation of pastor. Tell me about your experience in that vocation of husband and father during this time, because the life of the church is disrupted, but everybody else's life in general has been disrupted. Pastors not excluded. So
Right.
tell me a little bit about how it's been as in your vocation of husband and father.
Schedule got flipped upside down.
Mm-hmm.
It just, it just had to become whatever it was. I mean, it just, you didn't get to dictate anything.
Yeah.
You felt like you were just floating on a wave in a bad way. No oar, you're just in a boat and you're at the whim of the current.
Yeah.
It was kind of ridiculous because I have they were 2 and 4 at the time. You're not getting them to be quiet downstairs while dad is upstairs recording a service for Sunday. Right. It's just not happening.
Right. They're in their home. This is the place where they get to play.
So do you actually like reprimand or penalize them for doing what a 2 and a 4-year-old do? Right. No, that's not fair. It's quite unreasonable. Thankfully, we had amazing weather in March and April. So much of the time when I was recording, my bride could take my kids on a bike ride. I love to mountain bike. my boy is turning into an excellent mountain biker, and my little
good.
girl loves it too.
Good.
So they would just take off on the bikes, go to the trails, because we have amazing trails right by our house.
Yeah.
So they would just go for an hour and come back, and that would work. But, you know, my boy wasn't in preschool.
Yeah.
So, you know, it became quickly apparent that my bride also needed a break because, you know, we would normally go to the rec center and send our kids to this kid zone to play while we work out for an hour, and my wife would get the chance to decompress. Or they would go to Bible study fellowship or go here or go there, and my wife would get a reprieve to talk to adults.
Right.
But I still have a full-time job. It's just not in my office or at church. And so that really upended the routine, just got totally upended. And we had to revamp pretty quickly what it was going to look like. But with me recording on Fridays and then being home and sitting on the couch with my family watching myself, it was neat to be with my family on Sunday. I really enjoyed it. Like, it was great. I could hold my kid and I say, go get my first hymnal, and, you know, I get to walk through it with them, which was really special. But so much of the routine was we had to find other things to do, because we couldn't do the normal things to get the kids burned out so they'd take a nap, or give my bride a break during nap time so she could go for a bike ride. And you know, family's not coming to visit. We're not spending times with all of our friends and their friends. And the one that really hurt was when, and my son still asks it, Dad, when will people not be sick anymore? I don't know, buddy. I want them to not be sick. Well, should we pray over those people? Let's pray that they get better so that we can go play.
But
that too.
It's an important, you know, there's a couple of important things that you've said there, but on that last point, you know, talking to kids and not trying to necessarily, you know, you want to protect them, but you don't want to hide things from them. So addressing it on their level, and you'll have to know, you know, if anybody, you know, watching this, you'll have to know your own children and what they can handle and what their maturity level can handle, and continuing to talk about them. I realize we're a year into the pandemic, but you know, just in general, talking to them about world events, according to their maturity. You know, about the schedule stuff, I noticed that my hours were greatly reduced, but the hours that I worked were much more productive, because I knew that I only had a finite amount of time to get Bible study ready. I only had a finite amount of time to get my sermon written. I couldn't go spend half a day following some theological rabbit hole that may or may not get a sentence of reference in the sermon or something like that. So my time got very much focused and productive when I had that opportunity to. I'm 5 minutes away from the office, so I would sneak away for maybe 2 hours a day, but those 2 hours were maybe the most productive 2 hours maybe ever in my life, and especially in those early days of the pandemic.
I've encountered similar. Initially, when we were recording and then doing the broadcast premiere, my workload increased at that time. Because I was doing the video editing. So for a 1 hour service, it would take me about 2 hours to edit it, because I was doing it on my phone. And so editing on my phone. And then I had to download the new edited file to the phone, which would take an hour. Well, what are you doing during that time? You're not writing a sermon. It's kind of like doing these papers at seminary called an exegetical. You didn't go to the library unless you had 3 hours unabridged, undedicated, like you could just sit there. You're not going to go and pull out 30 books to sit there for 30 minutes. It just didn't work. And so I'm watching this ticker download this, and then I have to upload it to YouTube. But then in order to get it onto Facebook, Facebook won't acknowledge a video until it's been up for at least for a certain period of time.
Okay.
Because again, Facebook and YouTube are enemies.
Mm-hmm.
So Facebook doesn't want to make it possible for you to use YouTube in any kind of expediency and Facebook.
Right.
So I had to back time all of this and just sit here and watch things load and download. And
yeah,
I'd spend 10 hours preparing, like not doing what a pastor was trained to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't like that. I'm glad that is over.
Sure.
Because now it's a lot easier. It's on Facebook and it's just there.
Yeah.
And it's fine.
Yeah.
But now you're right. So what I do is we're homeschooling.
Okay.
Both of our kids, because they're both in preschool now. Yeah. Just because the timeline works for our family a lot better. Mm-hmm. So I work from home in the morning.
Okay.
And then come to church in the afternoon.
Okay.
But I still have some work I need to do when they're doing their work.
Right.
And I find that I have become slightly more efficient. Okay. With certain parts of that time.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, Ben, I really appreciate all your time and you sharing and being so open and reflecting with us. Just a little bit more. Were there any surprises, positive or just surprising in general, that came out that are going to stick with you through the rest of your ministry?
So when we started doing live broadcast, mm-hmm. Or just video recording in general, I was like, as soon as we're back, this is gone. I am done with this. Yeah. Because it was so much work, especially early on. We got it really dialed in now. Mm-hmm. But I was, you couldn't have convinced me that we were going to keep online worship in perpetuity. Okay. Until I started seeing random people I'd never met start to watch and like and comment on our Facebook page. Mm-hmm. And I'm asking other people, and no one has ever heard of these names. No one knows who they are. Uh-huh. So from the Facebook admin page, I started messaging some of them. Mm-hmm. And I'd say, I pray over our members regularly, but I know them, so I kind of know what to pray about. Right. I'm glad you're joining us for online worship, and I'd like to pray for you, but I don't really know what to pray for. Is there anything specific I could be praying for? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. What followed was remarkable. And it changed my perspective with the first response as to why and how you can better do online worship. It was remarkable because I had people telling me about divorces and financial troubles and relationship issues, but also the joy of worshiping with a family of faith because their church wasn't doing anything. And then they started asking, could I come to worship in person? Wow. Well, yeah. Sure. And then after I had one individual, after 2 times in person, I'd like to become a member. How can I do that? Praise be to God. Right? Yeah, that's wonderful. And so I started, that changed how I started interacting with that little black box. Oh, I started, I remember in homiletics class, sermon writing class with Professor Utek. Okay. He said, whatever you think your excitement level and your gestures are, double it. Because you're a lot more exciting in your head than you are in translation. Right. So if you think you're going wide-eyed, go really wide-eyed. If you think your arms are gestured, go really gestured. If you think your volume is loud, it's not loud enough. Okay. And so it got me thinking about what can be transmitted to this box without actually being in person. Yeah, yeah. And so I started watching myself on video a
Yeah.
little bit differently. And
How hard is that? And how would you encourage other pastors if they haven't been? Would you encourage them to go and do that?
yeah, I remember in another class, another preaching class with Dr. Schmidt, he had us watch our sermon on fast forward.
Oh, uh-huh.
Or what it was like 1.5 or
Oh,
something.
uh-huh.
So it was a little bit faster, and you start to see like nervous
Oh,
twitches and things that you subconsciously do.
right.
And so you're aware of delivery and
Mhm.
what people see and what people hear, and your nonverbals as well as your verbals.
Okay.
So I think some of that translated to, this is actually the proclamation of the gospel.
Mhm.
And in some sense, it's the gathering of the saints in worship. And
Yeah.
so it changed.
Mhm.
Now, I also view it as it's intended to be a gateway to get them in
Mm.
community.
Sure.
I don't want to say in the building, but in community with the
Yeah.
family of faith.
Yeah.
Um,
So it's a tool, but it's not
yeah,
the goal. Is that
right.
okay?
I like that. That's exactly right. It's
Okay.
a tool, but it's not the goal. So
Okay.
that's where I then also started to see, the pandemic is going to go away sometime,
Mhm.
or Jesus will come back soon,
Right.
whichever one.
Right.
But as the pandemic goes away, people are going to want to get back in person.
Yeah.
But if a family goes on vacation or they're homesick, wouldn't it be wonderful if they had the opportunity to still
Yeah.
see their friends go up to children's message and
Mhm.
hear that joyful, loud singing tenor that they love listening to in the third row?
Yeah.
Those kinds of things that still help them to feel connected.
Mhm.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. So where I was one of the biggest skeptics of online worship prior to COVID,
Uh-huh.
having people share their faith with me and their
Mhm.
struggles with me via Facebook Messenger to the church with someone they don't know.
Yeah.
People are primed
Mm.
for a church of purpose,
Yeah.
and they're primed for a faith of purpose.
Mhm.
And that, to the pastor, don't sleep on the online worship. Don't sleep on any sermon.
Yeah.
I remember someone a couple years ago asking, when we had like a snowstorm and we had maybe 2 people in worship. He said, "Pastor, I hurt for you. It hurts to see that there aren't more people here."
Mhm.
I said, "I'm glad you're here."
Mm.
"Yeah, but I want more people here." I do too, but man, you can't downplay that one sermon.
Yeah.
You just can't downplay it.
Yeah.
And if I have joyful stories from being a pastor,
Mhm.
it's from the one sermon you never really were convinced was that great,
Yeah.
and you thought your delivery wasn't that great, and they
Yeah.
remember it, and
Yeah.
they say, "That really touched me." And you're like, "Man, that had to be a God thing, because
Right.
I was
Right.
not on point. That was a
Yeah.
Holy Spirit thing that day."
Yeah. Absolutely.
And then the one that you really love, you're like waiting for the compliment that never comes, and
Yeah.
you're like, "Yeah, that I guess Jesus must
Yeah.
increase that I may decrease."
Right.
This is,
Right.
and it's good. It's a good
Mhm.
rebuffing then in that moment.
Yeah.
But I was floored
Mhm.
at the number of people who have since become members. We've
Mhm.
taken in since March
Mhm.
4 members solely from first viewing online.
Wow. That's great. That's
It just blows my mind.
Yeah.
Praise be God.
Yeah. So last thing here before we close out, is there anything in the last year or that's just been on your mind that you're like, you know what, that's just been rolling over in your mind, whether it's theological or about church life or the life of a pastor, the life of a husband or a father, anything you've been thinking about that you're just like, man, I just want other people to know this. What might that be?
Uh, we always knew that the church was full of sinners,
Mm-hmm.
and COVID has exposed that this is true,
Mm.
and that emotions exacerbate sin.
Okay.
We're more prone to it
Mm.
when we're irritated, when we're agitated,
Mm-hmm.
and patience with someone who's having a reaction that isn't actually to you.
Mm.
I remember, I've talked with a number of non-believers or even Christians of a different denomination that get
Uh-huh.
angry about a response or something. And I don't remember where I learned this from. It's not my own thought, but
Okay.
when someone is angry with you about a theological point of view or an idea, there's this caricature
Mm.
behind you that
Uh-huh.
is Jesus, who they're really mad at, or
Oh.
God, or
Mhm.
someone who represented the church previously
Right.
that you had nothing to do with.
Yeah.
But it just happens to be that you're standing between them and that caricature,
Uh-huh.
and they're taking all of it out on you.
Yeah.
It's like the illustration from this book, Love
Okay.
and Respect, where
Uh-huh.
he says you come home from work and your wife's had a horrible day and she just unloads,
Mm.
and you didn't do anything
Yeah.
about that thing that she's upset about.
Right.
And it has nothing to do with you, and it's hard not to react emotionally to emotion.
Yeah.
That's what we are. We were created with emotions. They're good,
Yeah.
but not to be controlling of you.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen so much emotion just latch on to people,
Okay.
and anger following it.
Yeah.
And this one question I have just been mulling over that I've found diffuses almost any anger COVID related discussion, I guess,
Okay.
but it probably works elsewhere, is it comes from the TV show The Office,
Oh, uh-huh.
and it comes from who's the manager of the garage?
Oh, Daryl.
Daryl. Comes from Daryl Feldman.
Okay.
Daryl Feldman. He says, I think you should start over,
Mm.
because I don't think you want to go down that road. I don't
Yeah.
think you want your pastor reacting to that emotion. So
Uh-huh.
let's just reset.
Okay.
And you see the emotion and you acknowledge it,
Right.
and your
Right.
emotion's valid, but let's actually have a discussion. And then the next thing is, what do you want to ask me
Mm.
instead of this accusation? Or,
Sure.
I saw a fight in a store. Why aren't you wearing a mask?
Mm-hmm.
Why are you wearing a mask?
Mhm.
We've seen it all.
Yeah.
And then someone came and started caricaturing me
Mm-hmm.
to yell at me.
Mm.
I said, what do you want to tell me? What do you want to tell me? And just listen. You're
Yeah.
not gonna fix it.
No.
Why, who did you vote for? What do you want to tell me?
Right. Right.
What do you want to talk about?
Sure.
Because I don't think you really care what I have to say. You have already made up your mind about wanting to tell me something.
Yeah.
And so the emotions of COVID
Mm-hmm.
have allowed for just a lot more explosion on the internet, on social media, and a lot less patience. And it's understandable, because it's emotion begets emotion.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to see it, to be okay with it happening, and
Uh-huh.
know that they're not mad at you.
Right.
They're mad at COVID. I've had 2 family members die from COVID. I've had a church member die of COVID.
Yeah.
So it's a very different thing to see emotional conversations explode more than they normally would.
Right. Right.
Acknowledge the emotion,
Mm-hmm.
enter the emotion with them without letting it control you,
Right.
and engage a dialogue. And if they don't want to have a dialogue, have a good day.
Sure.
I'm going to go get a cup of coffee or a
Right.
beer. You want to come with me?
Right. Well, Ben, I really appreciate that closing thought about recognizing the emotion, entering into that emotion, but then inviting a conversation and not responding with that same type of emotion, but connecting. And I'm very appreciative of all the time that you've given to us today to share these reflections on COVID, to help us see that a lot of these conversations are conversations that other pastors and other congregations are dealing with. I really, as a brother pastor, as a fellow Christian, I appreciate your ministry and your faithfulness to your call, to your wife, to your children, and trying so hard to see a way through all of this pandemic and these situations that can be so fraught with emotion and uncertainty, and trying to lead a way forward. So Ben, I pray God's richest blessings on your ministry. And again, thank you for joining us for this conversation on our COVID conversations and reflections on the past year. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you for hosting this.
Glad to do it.